Welcome to scary whatever this is this week. I'm your old pal Bigfoot, greeting you with a heavy heart today because our videos got demonetized yesterday, and they got demonetized the day before, and they got demonetized the day before that, and then later on they're remonetized after no one's watching them anymore. The videos, if you're lucky and they're not demonetized, which doesn't happen to me anymore, they will make their money in the first day or two. There are very few that anyone will watch after the first day or two. So that's why YouTube has been deliberately demonetizing us on our first day with pretty much every video lately. I can't afford to hire anybody anymore. I can't afford to do the channel anymore. So here's another video from last year or the year before because I literally can't afford to make new ones. Hope you enjoy it. And please let me know when they put the ads back after they inevitably demonetize it. Thank you. Dogman made me ill. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. When I was 18 and had just graduated high school, I spent the summer with my parents before heading away to college. That was the summer I became violently ill because of the noxious presence of an actual, physical, real-life, animal and not supernatural, Dogman. I need to tell you a couple of things about myself first. On the one hand, I'm a rationalist and a semi-materialist. I tend to lean toward the scientific explanation over others, but I also acknowledge that sometimes the current scientific position is later changed after new knowledge overrules former assumptions. So, I'm an open-minded but scientifically oriented person. On the other hand, I tend to be an incredibly sensitive person. I notice mood shifts in others in real time. I am the first to smell that the gas in the oven has been left on. I hear noises before others notice them, things like that. People like that about me. They call it my superpowers. The other side of those so-called superpowers, though, is that I tend to be hurt by mild teasing, and I find being in large groups overwhelming. People dislike this about me, and it causes them to call me oversensitive or thin-skinned. They can't understand that this is all part of one package hardwired together. I'm like the canary in the coal mine. If I fall ill, you all better look out for yourselves because it might affect you next. So, one day I woke up feeling kind of normal and went out back to plan out some of the things I wanted to do that day and that week. Even though I was mainly on vacation, I had some friends I wanted to spend time with before going away, and I had some bits of part-time work that people had offered me money to do for them. I needed that cash, so I had to sort everything out. I went out on my parents' wooden back porch and I plopped in a chair by the table there and started jotting down everything I had to do. Almost immediately, I felt that unmistakable feeling that you get when you're about to be ill. I had never had it come on me like that before. I was okay one second, felt that I was going to be very sick the very next second. I'll spare you the details, but it was not pretty. I remember leaning on the fencing surrounding the balcony, catching my breath and wondering what had just happened. I turned my gaze to the woods just past the end of the yard and I saw it. It was like a man, but it wasn't a man. It was like a dog or a wolf, but standing up. It was a wolf on steroids. That's the term that popped into my head when I saw it. There is a wolf on steroids standing up, giving me the meanest, nastiest, angriest look anyone or anything had ever given me. It was a Dogman. It was standing in and out of the trees. I remember it hiding itself, yet I remember what it looked like in its entirety. It looked like Satan, really. I am not certain how much of my memories are distorted, as I had lost a lot of fluids and my brain was not functioning normally. I felt in that moment, though, that this Dogman was the reason I was sick, and I screamed at him to get out of there. I waved my arms and hollered. The creature walked off in the woods and my mother came out to see what I was shouting about. Before I was really okay again, I told her everything. She could see and smell for herself that I was telling the truth about having become ill suddenly. There was no mistaking that part of the story. I think she assumed that the part about the Dogman was a hallucination, though. And when I got better in about an hour or two, I was kind of thinking the same thing myself. It seemed like that was the most logical answer. The problem with assuming that this was a hallucination to me personally was that I could remember seeing the thing like I remembered anything else. If that was a hallucination, how could I be sure everything else wasn't also? The only reason I was thinking the Dogman was a hallucination was that Dogmen are not supposed to exist. If I lived in a society that didn't feel that way, then I would have no doubt at all that this dogman was there when I got sick. In other words, there was nothing at all in my actual personal experience to suggest that the creature wasn't really there. So things went fine for a couple of days, and then I went to stay with my friend. Let's call him Jimmy. We had been close through high school, but we were about to enter colleges on opposite sides of the country, so we wanted to have some time to chill together since we didn't really know if and when we would get to do it again. His family owned a lot of undeveloped land they didn't use, and they let hunters hunt there sometimes. We decided to camp in that area from Wednesday to Friday when there weren't supposed to be any hunters in the area. We hoped that this meant less chance of us getting shot, but the only thing we knew for certain is that if we heard gunshot, it would be a poacher who had no permission to be there. This was our window of opportunity to use the land, and so we grabbed it. We found a good spot, set up camp, and started having fun immediately. We made a fire and roasted hot dogs we had brought with us. We were generally having a very good time. When dusk came and it started to get dark, we started trying to creep each other out with scary stories. I was in the middle of telling an old one from my childhood when I became disoriented and couldn't remember what I was saying. Jimmy asked me if I was okay, and I suddenly realized I was not. I got up to leave the camp realizing I was about to be sick. I fell right back down again, and now I was dizzy. My stomach and back ached intensely, and I managed to get up and stagger out of camp into the bushes to be ill. When I finished, I looked up, and I saw it. I should have known I'd seen it. It was the Dogman, only now it couldn't have been more than 40 or 50 feet away in the trees, staring at me. Just staring at me. I could feel the world spinning around me, but I held onto a tree to keep from falling and did my best to shout at the monster. I wanted it to go away. Its presence was making me sick. It didn't go away, though. It just stood there. And then it bared its teeth at me, and I immediately went back to being sick. The next thing I remember is waking up in my tent, and I could see that the sun was coming up. I knew that the Dogman had moved on. I felt fine, and I started making breakfast. Jimmy soon got up and joined me, but he was giving me strange looks. I asked him why. "You sure seem hungry for a guy who should be having a major hangover this morning." I didn't know what he was talking about with a hangover. I had some beers the night before. Did he think that was why I had gotten sick? I told him that last night I had seen a Dogman, and that was what had made me sick, not the beer. Jimmy didn't know what a Dogman was, and when I explained that it was an animal which looked like a werewolf, he burst out laughing and he couldn't stop. He got on his phone. He was barely able to get on the internet through it. This was a while back. Our phones were more primitive then, and the internet on the phone was relatively new. Not all the images would load sometimes, that sort of thing. But after about an hour of reading up on the Dogman, my friend Jimmy started to get a little freaked out. He pointed out that none of these stories he was reading were about the monster making people sick. It didn't have a magical sickness ray or anything. I reminded him how oversensitive I am to everything and asked him if the Dogman would make anyone sick, wouldn't it make me sick first? Maybe it was us being alone together in the woods away from civilization, but he was starting to accept everything I was saying as quite possibly the truth. Jimmy suggested we pack up and head back to his family's house. His parents were relatively chill for adults, and they would let us party there instead. Then I wouldn't have to worry about the nausea, and Jimmy wouldn't have to worry about being eaten by a giant hairy bipedal dog-headed monster. I was telling him that I would be fine and that I was certain the monster had moved on when the pain gripped me again and I knew it was too late. The Dogman was back. We'll be back also with part 2 of this story right after this.
Come out to the Northeast Comic-Con this July 6th through 8th to meet Scary Stories creator Peter Bernard, as well as Mickety Munkety Dolans, the real original Greg Brady, Barry Williams, Pansy Parkinson from Harry Potter, Scarlet Byrne, CJ Ramone from the real original Ramones, Jay Peterman from Seinfeld, John O'Hurley. Plus, if you're lucky, you might get to appear in a cartoon with me, yo! Hooray!
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
And now, part 2 of The Dogman Made Me Ill. I don't remember passing out, but I do remember waking up in a strange room. Panic made my heart beat fast for a few seconds until I realized I was in the guest room at Jimmy's parents' place. I wondered if I had gotten there under my own power or what. The rest of that day was lost with Jimmy's mother bringing me to see their family doctor, who of course saw nothing wrong with me and suggested I had possibly suffered from some food poisoning. I didn't tell him anything about the Dogman because I'm not a complete idiot and I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. When we got back to Jimmy's place and he and I were alone in his room playing his old board game version of Battleship, we talked about what was happening. I was sick anytime that creature was around, but it seemed to be wandering all over our area. Why had I never experienced this before? None of it really made any sense. Then Jimmy remembered that when they built the new mall up the hill, they took down an awful lot of trees to put that up. Maybe the Dogman was a migratory animal moving along to wherever the food was in each season, and maybe its yearly migration was now upset by the shopping mall. Maybe that used to be its hunting turf and now it was searching for a new place. That might explain why it had been at my house a few weeks earlier and now was at Jimmy's, who lived about 15 miles west of my family. It might continue westward unless it found these good hunting grounds, in which case it might stay indefinitely, making me ill for the rest of my last summer in my hometown. I didn't have money to just go away, so this idea really seriously bummed me out. I don't like being sick, nobody does. This Dogman had to get out of town. After that, I focused on getting all the work done I had promised people I would do. I no longer could take my health for granted, so I had to set priorities and get the most important things done first. I never really felt 100% well after that, but I don't know how much of it was stress of knowing that the Dogman might come around any time, as opposed to it actually being there. By the end of July, I was sick just from the idea that I might be sick. The Dogman could have left weeks ago for all I knew. But it hadn't. One night I woke up in the bathroom being sick. I have no memory of getting there. When I was done, I was so angry that I grabbed my baseball bat in one hand and a big old kitchen knife in my other, and I went out in the backyard, screaming for that monster to show itself. I don't know what I thought I would do if he did, but I shouted and screamed at the forest. That was where my dad found me, and boy did that take a lot of explaining. The thing is, when I got done explaining it all to my father, he believed me. I know that's really weird, but for whatever reason, he believed me. Now, my father and I had never been close. He was always the first to lead the cheers against me, that I was oversensitive. However, that was the exact reason he believed me this time. He knew I could sense things that the rest of them would ignore. He asked me to describe the Dogman in as much detail as I could manage. I said it was tall, evil-looking, and very angry. It seemed like it had a kind of intelligence, although not a human kind of intelligence. It seemed very alien, but I didn't mean from outer space. It had tall, pointed ears on top of its head, and its fur was somewhat long, as I remember seeing it blow in the breeze. It had a dog-type snout, or like a wolf. It was a canine-type creature, and yet it seemed very much like a primate or ape or chimp. It stood taller than a chimp, though, and much taller than a gorilla. It had dog legs, not primate legs, yet it walked with as much balance as a human. I don't remember its feet, but I remember its front paws were deformed looking, like something halfway between a wolf's paws and some kind of Halloween claw gloves of some sort. So I didn't even notice he had left, but about a day and a half later my father came back from a hunting trip from which he said he had been unsuccessful. He wanted to see me immediately and started to pitch the idea to me that I should go hunting with him. I had never wanted to go hunting with him before, as I empathized too strongly with the animals. To his credit, my father had never asked me to go hunting with him before. He might be a guy who loves hunting, but he's also a guy that's not going to try to push you into loving what he loves. But this time, he was insisting. It turned out he had gone off hunting for the Dogman. About a day into it, he realized he was finding nothing and he wouldn't even know what to look for, whereas I could literally sense the presence of the beast. If he had me with him, he might be able to find the animal and bag it, thereby curing me of the illness and ridding the neighborhood of a potentially dangerous predator. He was also eager to be the first to capture such a creature, so there was the matter of his ego involved in this as well, but I agreed anyway. It was my first time my father had ever sort of offered to help me out in a way, and at the very least it was nice to have someone who believed what I was saying about this hairy bipedal dog monster. So we went off into the wild with each other, and it was fairly excruciating. We didn't really have anything to talk about with each other, although I tried vainly to make conversation. By the second day, all our conversation consisted of my father asking me how I felt and me saying, okay. We weren't running into any dogmen. Maybe the creature had migrated onto the next feeding area. Maybe we were wasting all this effort on nothing. Then that night we lit a campfire and I wanted to tell ghost stories. Dad didn't want to. I started telling one anyway just because I needed to be talking after a full day of silence. I was halfway through the story when I realized I was about to become really sick. I tried to stand up and fell face forward into the fire, being caught at the last second by my father, who saved me from possibly burning to death. The rest of what happened is blurry, and partially I know the story from my father telling me about it later. I remember laying on my side in a lot of pain, and the monster was there. My head was literally on the ground, so that wolf thing looked 75 feet tall to me. The ground shook as my father began firing. I had no problem with this, as it was self-defense. The creature had come for us, and my father had a right to defend us. I just remember the explosions, and then I was asleep. When I woke up, it was before dawn. I was back in my tent in my sleeping bag, and I wondered if I had dreamed the events of the night before. I had to wait till dawn to quiz my father, but when the sun finally came up, he explained everything to me. I had gotten sick, and he caught me and laid me down. In the process of doing so, he spotted the creature just as I had described it, standing just within the woodline, staring at us. It was much larger than he had been expecting it to be. It walked out of the woods and he began firing. He said he brought a weapon that should have felled a bear, but the creature didn't even flinch when he was hit. Rather than falling, the animal only got angrier and it screamed at my father. He dropped his gun and realized he was at the mercy of this beast. Then, instead of finishing him off, the monster simply turned around and walked back into the woods and was gone. Now, as I've said already, I view myself as a scientific rationalist, so I don't see anything in this story that would lead me to think that this was anything other than a kind of animal which is noxious and toxic for humans to be around. Possibly it emitted an odor that I couldn't consciously smell, but which made me sick. Another possibility is that it gave off vibrations like infrasound, which can sometimes be very dangerous for humans to be around. Whatever it was, I'm certain there was and is a scientific and rational explanation for it. My father, on the other hand, found his religion on the day he saw that Dogman. He became convinced that this was an agent of the devil because anything natural falls when you shoot it. He started going to church on Sunday mornings instead of hunting, and even now in the nursing home, the walls in his room are lined with crucifixes. The incident completely and totally changed him as a person. And maybe that's why this all happened, who knows? Neither of us ever saw the Dogman again, and I've mostly had a healthy adulthood so far as well. I guess part of that is that Dad doesn't go hunting anymore, and I don't leave the confines of the city. I wonder if we're going to hear more stories like this over the years as humanity more and more encroaches on the land held for so many generations by Dogman. Ferocious Dogman versus Ravenous Sasquatch. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. Nobody believes the story I'm about to tell you, most of all me. These are the ravings of a lunatic and a madman, yet what I'm about to tell you is exactly how I remember things happening the day I saw two supposedly mythical predators battle ferociously right in front of my very eyes. This is a story from the 1970s when I took a few years off after college to quote-unquote find myself. It's what all the in kids were doing back then. Only I took it very seriously and I went searching in more far-off places than most people would. As we say now in the 21st century, I went completely off the grid and I stayed there for almost a year and a half. When I returned to civilization, I had a beard that all my friends made fun of me for. There was a TV show back then called Grizzly Adams, and that became my new nickname. I did get to see a grizzly bear one time, and fortunately it was pretty far off. I once had a real fight with a hungry bobcat, and I got torn up pretty bad, but it came out alive. I just missed getting bitten by a rattlesnake and I kicked it in the head by accident as I freaked out in reaction. To be honest, I'm lucky I made it out alive there too. There was a time when I was hiding in the Bankhead National Forest in northern Alabama. Living there. It's around an hour and a half north of Tuscaloosa and I guess about 2.5 hours south of Nashville. I'll tell you what though, it can be hard to tell the boundaries of that forest since most of the area that people live in around it is still pretty forested. I kept moving to a new place to camp each night and foraged for food during my days. I never got any hassle from the rangers who I would wave to when they passed by. Technically, I wasn't really living there, I was just living, and I happened to be there while I was doing it. I don't see how that could possibly be wrong in anyone's eyes. So let's jump to the big scene. I was camped out and sleeping when something woke me up. I caught the tail end of a scream that sounded like it was right outside my tent. I want to say a woman's scream. To be honest, I just know it was the scream of someone or something. Sometimes big cats can sound almost human when they cry in the night, and I wondered if one of them had wandered into my camp. If so, he must be hungry or else deranged and sick. All at once I was shaking all over. I remember the feeling of absolute fear gripping me. That scream had been loud. It was like deep sleep one second, awake and shaking all over the next. I wanted to poke my head outside the tent, but I was too chicken and opted to sitting as still as I could manage instead. I remember listening as intently as I ever had and wondering what would come next. All my attention was to the left of the tent where I had heard the scream. I heard nothing at all now, but I knew something was about to go down. From behind me, with zero warning, came a roar. That was different from the scream. This was not the same thing that had screamed to my left. This was something else that had roared to my right. I wondered what could be going on since both of those sounded like the cries of a predator, not prey. Was I sleeping in the middle of a turf war? Was I about to be drawn into it? Now I was listening to all directions around me, not knowing what was happening. In front of me was the tent flap, so inviting. I wanted to go outside and see what was happening so badly, but I had no weapons with me other than a Swiss Army knife, of which I think I had the corkscrew drawn to use for defense if necessary. I am not ashamed to admit that I got on my knees and in my head I silently prayed. I apologized for all my sins and asked for permission to make amends with anyone I had wronged. I prayed for this little battle outside to move elsewhere. Weeping as quietly as I could, I sat with my back against the tent. Never had I felt so powerless before. It was all entirely out of my control. I had to just pray that I wasn't going to get hurt tonight. And then, something poked me in my back through the tent, and I screamed and went flying through the tent flap and running across the field, almost tripping and falling down the side of the steep hill. I found a tree and hid behind it, peeking out. That was the first time in my life that I ever saw a Sasquatch. And the last time too, at least so far. So yeah, anyone can see a Sasquatch peeking out at him from behind the tree. But it takes someone like me to be peeking out from behind a tree at a Sasquatch. There he was. A giant, hairy man, just like they say. I don't remember much in the way of details as I was in absolute horror and convinced that I was about to die. Also, this was a long time ago. Anyway, it looked like a man in the face, a primitive man. It didn't look like an ape, except its fur was very much like an ape's fur. I never thought it was a gorilla or a chimp. It was too tall and it stood almost as straight as a human. It was definitely something we would call Bigfoot. He was carrying my bag of food with him. I used to tie my food up in a plastic bag and hang it up from a tree higher than any of the local animals should be able to reach. I wanted to keep my food out of camp in order to prevent bears from wandering in and eating all of it. Anyway, this Bigfoot had taken all my food down and was eating it like popcorn. I had various kinds of nuts and berries that grew locally and a big bag of sunflower seeds that I had bought a long time ago. He was making an absolute mess of everything and eating my entire stash while he seemed to be looking around for something. I was pretty sure I knew what it was. I had been cooking a fish that I caught earlier and it probably smelled for miles. I had finished it though, and all that was left were some bones. He finished all the berries and whatever he found edible in my bag, then focused on searching even harder for the location of the fish. That's when I heard that roar again. From behind me, I dropped to the ground immediately. I couldn't believe the Sasquatch wasn't the one who had made that roar. I was looking directly at him and then heard the roar behind me. I held as still as I could, and from my position behind the tree, I really couldn't see anything at all. Then, incredibly loud, I heard the scream again. That was the sound the Sasquatch made. It was deafening, and my heart was beating like a tiny bird's heart. I felt like I was going to die even if none of these impossible things ever touched me. The fright of the situation was impossible to endure. It was excruciating. I wanted to run but knew I was better off just making myself as small as possible and waiting for this situation to play itself out. And that's what it did all right, as this freaking Tyrannosaurus of a marsupial dog monster animal came smashing out of the forest to my left, and I literally held onto the tree in front of me. This thing shook the ground so much when it moved. I could hear these two monstrosities screaming at each other like kaiju, and I figured the battle was over my fish. Why didn't they just catch their own? They had to know where the water sources were around there. The food was not that scarce. After all, I had been living off it. Suddenly I felt a bit guilty. Had my diet impeded on theirs? In my defense, neither of these things were supposed to even exist, so how could I know? I peeked out from behind the tree and witnessed the most vicious fight I hope to ever see. It was 10 times that modern UFC kind of fighting. These animals were not bluffing, and they were not just looking to get the other to back down. For some reason, my camp had become ground zero in a turf battle between two very desperate and humorless looking beasts. The Bigfoot was taller, but the dog-headed roaring beast walked bent over with his tail held out behind him. To me, that was probably a marsupial that just looked like a dog. It was sort of like a running kangaroo with a larger head and huge saber-like fangs. It had claws, but its arms were very short compared to the Bigfoot. I guess that's why it made me think of a tyrannosaur. I'm trying to imagine it in my mind, and I think it had arms as long as a human's proportionally, but don't hold me to that. Definitely the Bigfoot had the advantage in terms of reach, but he didn't seem to use it. The Dogman was lunging at the Sasquatch's throat, going straight for the kill from the word go. He would get a hold of the Bigfoot's arm and just snap at it. The Bigfoot fought back in much the same way when I thought he really should have been using his massive arms. The Dogman had all the momentum, and the two rolled around on the ground, stirring up dust and screaming a lot. The Bigfoot seemed genuinely surprised at the ferocity of the upright walking canine, and he soon beat it off into the forest. The Dogman chased him, made sure he was gone, then went to work making an absolute mess of my camp. Dogman tore nearly every one of my earthly belongings to absolute shreds, and I couldn't do anything but watch him do it. The needless destruction really annoyed me. It seemed unnatural and a waste. They say only humans destroy for no reason, but that night, I saw some utterly pointless destruction carried out by that werewolf or whatever it was. But I consider myself lucky to be annoyed or to feel anything at all, since that was a very close call. I had to go stay with my parents and get back on my feet enough to go back in the wild, but I did do another 5 or 6 months off the grid after that. So I guess I can't say that either Bigfoot or Dogman scared me off of camping. I just never camped in that forest again. Dogman capsized my kayak, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. I've told this story to a few friends, and I got laughed at once, ridiculed the second time, and the third time I was told that I hadn't seen a Dogman, I had seen a Sasquatch. At that point, I gave up trying to tell friends about what happened at all. I was going to remain silent forever, but I figured nothing would be lost by me adding an anonymous version of the events to your show. Okay, I was out kayaking in the Everglades with some friends while on spring break back when I was just 21 years old. My friends were also about the same age, and their names were Rocco, Jelka, his girlfriend, and Karina, who was my girlfriend. Rocco and Jelka were Croatian, and I forget why they were in America, like a student exchange or something, but we were really only friends for that 1 year while they were here. Now we keep in touch on Minds a bit, but I haven't asked them in person to tell this story, so the less said about them the better. I'm not trying to expose them to ridicule, just to tell my story. So, we were kayaking through the Everglades without a guide, which is not something you should ever do. We were idiots, but that doesn't mean you have to be. The thing that happened to us was so weird that it probably might never ever happen to anyone else ever again, but we weren't even prepared for any of the well-known dangers down there either. And by not prepared, I mean both in terms of equipment or mentality. Okay, I have no idea exactly where we were, except that there were trees on either side and it was a long body of water. Sometimes the trees would come up super close to the boat and we could see the little lizards crawling all over them like cockroaches. Who knows how many snakes and other dangerous animals we were right up next to, but too lost in our own little world to even notice. Then again, we were so loud that we probably scared most everything away. I thought it was kind of cool how in some places the roots of the trees were all above ground. I guess they hadn't always been, but the water constantly flowing changes many things. We were having too much fun to notice that it was getting later. Karina told me she was seeing eye shine coming from inside the roots looking at us, and I thought she was joking. It sounded like she was doing her fake scared voice, but it turned out that sounded the same as her real scared voice, and she started getting me a little scared too. I figured they were alligators or snakes or that kind of thing. We decided to make a turn-off, thinking it would lead us back towards civilization. We were more than a little wrong about that. So the night started coming on and we were kayaking with no compasses or maps or idea where we were heading. It was already getting hard to see in front of us. Rocco suggested we get out and camp, and the other three of us shouted to him that he was a moron. We kept rowing, growing pretty tired. I know I felt like my arms were going to fall off, and I was in the best shape of the four of us. We were exhausted and decided to try to nap there on the water. I know that was not a good idea. We were supposed to take turns sleeping. I don't know, when you're really tired, your ability to reason becomes fractured. So, I don't know what happened exactly, but the next thing is I'm waking up because I've been hit from below by something. I screamed and was very disoriented waking up. It looked like everyone else was waking up too, but it was so dark I might have imagined that. I had my flashlight out in a second, shining it around in the water and not seeing what bumped me. I told everyone what happened and asked if alligators did that. Nobody knew. Somebody said I had just imagined it in a dream, and then in the middle of a very loud splashing sound, a dog rose up out of the water and started climbing on top of my kayak. We all screamed and I started to beat it back with my oar and then with my fists. The thing turned me over and I was entirely submerged, then back up in the air again. I could see absolutely nothing under the water and could barely make any more out in the night air. Rocco came close enough to hit the water wolf hard a few times, and the thing simply dropped down into the water like a dead weight, disappearing completely. That did not happen. Dogs are not fish. Karina was becoming delirious. With another loud splashing sound, we saw the creature emerge from the water onto the shoreline. It was a dog and it was huge. We could smell wet dog all over and it was nasty. We watched as the dog shook himself off, water spraying everywhere, and then, to our great surprise, he stood up on his hind legs. We were now looking at the back of a 6 or 7 foot tall creature, covered in fur and dripping wet. I shone my flashlight on the animal and it turned around and squinted into the light, and then it screamed at us. I felt like it had just slapped me around and I cried as I started paddling out of there. That creature had scared me more than I had ever been scared in my life, and I paddled so hard, using reserves of strength far greater than I should have had. We all paddled, and we were truly panicked as the creature decided to follow along on the shoreline. We could see him some of the time, Then he would be out of sight behind trees and we would wonder if the horror was over. Then we would hear him in the brush and we'd start paddling faster and faster. One time he ran ahead of us and dove in the water. We had no idea what to do and stopped paddling. I think someone tried to paddle backward against the current. The dog just swam across in front of us to the other side, then continued along, trailing us on our journey. We soon saw why, as there was no passage on the right coming up for a while. Of course the Dogman would have known that before reaching the spot. This was a creature in his own habitat, and we were very far from ours. Rocco thought the creature was hurting us and said we should not follow it. I asked him where else we could go except down the river since it wasn't like we had a helicopter. He started bickering and the two women started fighting as well, and then the Dogman roared. That shut us up. We paddled dutifully from then on, not speaking, trying not to even think. Morning came and Karina noticed we hadn't seen or heard the dog for a while. We eventually found a place to land near some buildings and wandered from there until we were suddenly in some town where we got ourselves breakfast. And that was that. We were just back to civilization like nothing had happened. And really it almost was like nothing had. We could have lost our lives, but we didn't, and so it might as well have been a dream. Who ever heard of a werewolf in the Everglades? And who ever heard of an aquatic dog that attacks boats from underneath? Even people who believe in Dogman aren't going to believe in a story like that. And yet, that is exactly what I remember happening the night I almost got drowned by Dogman. And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh wait, YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story. Do Dogmen live in trees? As told to and read by Peter Bernard. When I was a kid, I lived in a house with my 2 younger brothers in the suburbs. We had bedrooms on the 2nd floor with trees outside our windows that were next to trees that were next to trees all the way back around to the forest nearby. We each had tree houses as my father built a new one each time my parents had a son. Mine was furthest east, my middle brother John's was furthest west because we each wanted our own space when we were kids. When Justin was born, our youngest brother, Dad built his in the center with bridges so that now all 3 are connected. We can lock the doors if we want privacy, and there's a walkway around them so we can walk around all 3 whether the insides are locked or not. It was the most fun place in the world for us until one night we figured out that Dogman was living in those trees. Now I know what you're saying, it must have been Sasquatch because primates are naturally tree dwellers whereas canines always stick to the ground. Well, I guess that's not true for canines who have opposable thumbs, and this story will explain what I mean. When I was 18, I got my own room, but this story happened when I was 17, John was 15, and Justin was 13. We still shared one bedroom. I had my own bed, and they shared bunk beds like Greg, Peter, and Bobby. That was my nickname back then, in fact, Greg Brady, because I was the oldest of the 3 of us. We didn't have the sisters from the TV show, and we had no problem with that either. So one night, Justin woke me up and he was crying. I asked him if he hurt himself, and he said no. I was getting scared because I couldn't figure out what his problem was, and I was afraid something really bad had happened. He kept looking over my shoulder out the window and crying, so eventually I turned to see what he was staring at. That's when I saw it too, and let out a yelp. It was a long-nosed monster, a hairy monster that looked like what a Russian wolfhound would look like if it were evil. I remember it seemed shaggy, but I also remember it having very short black fur, so those are contradictory memories. This was 40 years ago or so. I feel like it was baring its teeth or curling up its gums in an insanely angry-looking way, and its eyes were flashing at me like it hated me. I guess that's what it boiled down to. I got the feeling that this thing just hated my guts. My scream woke John up, and he screamed so loud and so long when he saw the creature that both of our parents woke up and came barging into the room to see what was wrong. We pointed to the window, but the creature was gone. We explained that this anteater-nosed monster had been staring in our window, and our father explained that outside our window was 20 feet off the ground. So how could anyone be staring in? That was a good question. Then it dawned on me and my brothers. This thing was in the tree outside our window. We ran over, and sure enough, there really was a big old sturdy branch going close to that window. This was a tree-climbing monster. Neither our father nor our mother believed us, and Mom pulled the shades closed, saying the anteater-nosed boogeyman wouldn't be able to give us dirty looks anymore. The next morning, I noticed my treehouse had been messed with. The doorknob was completely removed. It looked like it had been torn off. I was afraid to go inside and peered around the corner, trying to see if anyone was home, but nobody was. My stuff was thrown all over the place, but nothing was broken. I knew who I thought did it, and I ran to the house to alert my parents about it. In spite of the fact that my treehouse was broken into, neither of them would take the situation seriously. I still to this day don't get that part of it. Even if you don't believe your kids about a monster, why don't you react with alarm when your property is broken into and vandalized? I mean, the doorknob was ripped off the door. What could do something like that? And why would you send your kids back out to play in the same place this invader had just wrecked? So now I had the only one of the 3 tree houses with no lock, and I was pretty bummed out. I know 17 is a bit old to be sad about your treehouse, but it was this culture thing between me and my brothers, and I was sad to see these things going on that trampled on our years of growing up as best friends. We were all in my treehouse later that day when Justin noticed that there was a sort of a path in the trees from my treehouse over to our bedroom window. I thought he was seeing things or that it was an optical illusion, but he started walking it. He just walked off the treehouse walkway onto a branch. Then, hanging onto other branches for balance, he started walking along this naturally formed road that did in fact lead to our bedroom window. From one tree to the next, branches seemed to connect almost as though they were designed to do so. We told Justin to come back because we each wanted to walk the pathway ourselves. It was pretty amazing. I mean, I guess you have to say it was just by chance, but it sure looked like design. It was very easy to walk the entire way as long as we only went one at a time. I'm not sure some of the branches could take 2 of us at once. That night, we slept with the curtains closed. We heard tapping and scratching in the middle of the night. We all woke up. The 3 boys, I mean. We woke up, then heard the sound. But what woke us up in the first place? None of us had the nerve to get out of bed and look. We knew what was out there. It was the werewolf. The next day we decided that whoever the werewolf was, it had to be one of the neighbors. We didn't know about Dogman back then, so we thought this had to be someone who transformed into a wolfman, like in the old movies we watched on Creature Features and Chiller Theater. We reasoned that if it were so, then it likely was one of the neighbors whose trees linked to ours. If he could walk over to our window, then our window likely could be the starting point to walk back to him. So that day, we walked the length of our treehouse city, looking for any obvious pathways like the one that led to my treehouse. Once again, our youngest brother Justin was the one who spotted something in between my treehouse and his. It appeared to be another pathway through the trees that was a bit well worn, as though it had been well traveled. This one led away from our house onto the property of one of our neighbors we weren't allowed to talk to. He had a bad temper and he owned a lot of firepower, and he was close friends with the governor supposedly. He wanted to buy our land from my parents and they didn't want to sell, so he didn't like us very much. I was terrified of him myself. The only time I ever felt as hated as when the Dogman glared at me through the window was when this neighbor would glare at me. The more I thought about it, the more the two reminded me of each other. Neither of my brothers agreed with me though, because that neighbor was not dark with a long nose, he was pale-skinned with a pug nose. They agreed that the werewolf came from the direction of that guy's property though. We had no real proof, but we had a certainty in our bellies that we had found the path of the werewolf. Both John and Justin wanted to go follow the path and see what we could find, but I reminded them that the branches might only hold the weight of one person at a time. They set out anyway, one at a time, keeping each other in eye view while trying to only have one boy on each branch. I had no choice but to follow, since I was the oldest and I didn't want anything bad to happen to them. We followed the path for what seemed like a half hour. It was starting to get dark and I knew we'd better head back. They weren't listening to me though, and just kept heading further and further away from our home on branches 30 or 40 feet off the ground sometimes, over what looked like other people's backyards. I'm not sure exactly what happened because I was in the rear, but all of a sudden both of my brothers screamed and I saw them running, yes, running back in my direction, and they were about to crash right into me. Needless to say, I started retreating as quickly as I could manage. The sounds of their screams were horrible. They were genuinely terrified. I looked behind me and ran straight into a tree trunk, I think, or else a Mack truck. I started falling, then grabbed onto anything and everything around and managed to hold on as both of my brothers ran past screaming. I got on the path behind them, breathing a sigh of relief that I had my feet back on something solid. That's when I heard something I really didn't want to hear. From my right. Growling kind of sound, and when I turned around and looked, I saw him right there, the anteater-nosed werewolf. It was holding onto branches so that it was in effect standing at its full height, and I could see it was much taller than I was. It had to have been over 6 feet, probably much more. It was skinny though, like a dog but mixed with a man. Its arms and legs were a bit thicker than a dog's, but not much. It did have hands, or at least it had paws with opposable thumbs, and it used its hands to climb and to hold branches the same way a primate might. The last thing that I remember about that creature is that it roared. After that, I was running through branches trying to get back home. My brothers were long gone. I couldn't see or hear them in front of me. I wasn't sure if the monster was pursuing me or not, because my entire world right then was getting away and not falling to my death. Which I almost did. Fall to my death, I mean. I managed the falling part, but not the dying part. What happened was, as I got my and Justin's tree houses in sight, I stepped too hard on an old branch and it started to break underneath me. I was falling and moving forward simultaneously, and I grabbed another branch that broke, and another, then me and all my broken branches crashed hard into my mother's fig tree. I had some bruises on my back and legs for a few days, but I got lucky and I wasn't seriously injured. One side effect of my fall, though, was that the path had been disrupted. There was now a hole 25 feet across that you couldn't walk anymore between the trees, from our treehouse to that neighbor's property. Unless the creature could jump 25 feet through the trees, or unless it could find another path, we might be safe from the werewolf at our window. One of the things my brothers and I did the last 2 years we lived in the house was we did pathway patrol. All around the perimeter of our property, we would walk the trees, chopping off branches that were starting to get too close to reestablishing the pathway to the neighbor's home. That neighbor won out in the end, though. He owns the entire area now. I still sort of wonder if he was behind that black-furred, long-nosed, dog-headed entity, or if he knew about it, or if he was it. But there's no point in even thinking about it since I can't go back there ever again now it's his property. I wonder if, even to this day, the Dogman roams through those trees. The next time you wonder how Dogman can appear and disappear so suddenly, try looking up. You might find someone up there, looking down at you. This next story was told to me by our viewer Mark Caldwell on YouTube, and he gave me permission to write it up for the channel. I'm going to read it in the first person, telling Mark's story and sticking as closely as I can to the way he told it to me, using his own words whenever possible. 2 strange Dogman sightings in Kentucky, as told to Peter Bernard by listener Mark Caldwell, read by Peter Bernard. I had driven 2 acquaintances over to their rural home in my truck. It was near Hazel Green, Kentucky, on a 1-lane asphalt road. There was a country home on the left side, and directly across from the house along the right side of the lane was a hayfield. They went inside to conduct their business, and I stood around the front yard waiting on them. After a couple of minutes, I noticed 2 huge gray wolves traveling one behind the other through the field. There was an animal path I hadn't noticed running alongside the road about 40 feet from the lane. I remember thinking, why do animals make a path in the field instead of just using the road? And as they were passing in front of where I stood in the front yard of the home, I realized how big they were, and I had the sensation of fight or flight wash over me a bit. They were cruising up through the field, thankfully not interested in me, and seemed to be focused on some destination, off past where I could see. The grass in the hayfield was about 1.5 feet tall, and I couldn't see their paws, but I did notice the shoulders. The shoulders were wide and had a muscular shape that stood out to me, and I thought, those are some beefed up shoulders, sheesh. Just after they passed the house, the one in the rear turned its head over its left shoulder. My heart froze as it looked back at me. The strange wolf did have a sort of expression on its face, kind of a sly grin almost. Its eyes were intelligent, really intelligent, and that stood out to me as well. They had continued on, and I began considering if this area of Kentucky had a significant wolf population I wasn't aware of. I'm very familiar with our coyotes and have dealt with them on several occasions, but was surprised at seeing actual wolves, especially gray wolves, some freakishly extra large dire wolf species in Hazel Green, Kentucky I had apparently missed the memo about. Both of my acquaintances were fairly serious deer hunters, while I hunted only occasionally for deer and squirrel, a delicious game meal I actually crave a few times a year. I asked them if Kentucky recently had wolves added to our area, as happens with various species from time to time via wildlife management. Both of them laughed and said no, not to our knowledge. I told them what I had just seen pass by and pointed out the well-used game trail just off the lane as we pulled out to leave. The evidence was right in front of their noses, but I don't think they believed me. After reading that big article in the news recently about the strange wolf creature killed, and then finding out about recent multiple sightings of a large dogman spotted about 20 miles from here, I am curious that what I saw from about 60 feet away that day, could it have actually been 2 dogmen? So that happened on Lower Gilmore Road, Hazel Green, Kentucky, close to Daysboro. I don't know for sure if those were dogmen because they walked on all fours, but there are other stories from around here lately about upright walking canines pilfering through people's pickup truck beds, standing on 2 legs, walking around looking through people's trash bins, and also leaving huge prints around the nearby farm ponds. Let me tell you about a guy I know who's 70 years old and still going strong. Well, he told me this story that his wife told him. His wife was home alone, and she walked into the kitchen and froze. Outside, pilfering through the trash and stuff in the bed of my friend's farm pickup truck was a gray dogman standing up, leaning over the side of the bed. Now I wonder, was that the same kind of animal as the 2 I saw? This one was definitely bipedal. He was tossing around the truck bed's contents looking for something and had no luck doing so, whatever it was. He seemed to grow angrier and angrier and more frustrated. My wife's friend was so scared she couldn't move. She was afraid the dogman would hear the floor squeak, so she just froze in place, scared to even breathe. She watched as the dog-headed creature turned away from the truck. It had a look of mild aggravation on its face as it walked right past the kitchen windows. This lady was forced to stand there unmoving as the dogman literally passed within a few feet of her. She stared intently at the monster, but the dogman never looked in the house. She says it went down toward the farm pond area. My friend told me he investigated his wife's claims, and in fact, he had noticed huge wolf tracks all around the farm pond. He says his neighbor mentioned the same around his. Oh, there's another story too. About a week later, my friend's wife got a call from the elderly woman who lives next door to her. The lady told her, "I see it. It's outside looking around the vegetable garden." So it hasn't left the neighborhood. I told my friend my opinion, which is that it's likely an older dogman, keeping to itself for its own personal safety reasons. I have a theory that dogman culture has some similarities to other species in which the alpha male past their prime is not revered in their society. More like eliminated quickly. And so that's one man's update on the state of the Kentucky Dogman. Memorial Day Dogman. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. When I was a kid, we used to spend Memorial Day at my Uncle Jenkins and Aunt Lydia's mansion. At least we called it a mansion. It seemed large to us. The main thing about it that gave it a regal air was a long, manicured back lawn that led off into the distance, ending in the entrance to a somewhat old-growth forest. And that was where on Memorial Day when I was 13 years old that I saw an actual upright walking canid. The year I turned 13 was not my good luck year. My parents turned from a loving couple who cared about me to selfish individuals who at best looked at me with dead eyes. Dead was preferable to their angry eyes. They went from caring if I was tucked into bed comfortably to not caring to remember if I had gotten dinner. They only cared about defeating their spouse in some way, constantly competing. I had become a nuisance, just an obstruction in between them and winning another argument. I missed my parents, and the emotional pain of it was made worse by having to interact daily with these soulless corpses inhabiting my parents' bodies, doing sick little impersonations of people that I used to know and love. For that reason, it was almost a relief when they announced they would be spending Memorial Day separately. I requested to be able to go see Uncle Jenkins and Aunt Lydia and was told in a very cold manner by my mother that Uncle Jenkins was dead. She asked Aunt Lydia if I could come anyway and had gotten her assent for me to spend the entire week with her. I remembered all our previous Memorial Days as being warm and sunny. Too warm sometimes, in that way early summer can be, before you're really used to it. This Memorial Day, though, felt cold and gray and rainy. The skies seemed dark the entire weekend, and the fact that it was only 13-year-old me and grieving Aunt Lydia made it seem quieter and darker. When it wasn't raining, it was windy and cold and threatening to rain. We sat in the large dining room eating, just the two of us, with lightning flashing outside the windows. Sometimes we would invite the cook and the maid to join us eating. It made it more fun because we could allow them to initiate and steer the conversation. We'd talk about popular TV shows and recent public events. When Aunt Lydia and I were left alone, sometimes we'd begin to talk about my parents or Uncle Jenkins, and we'd get ourselves feeling as dark as the weather. It got so I'd see my aunt at breakfast and then again at dinner, and I'd spend the day wandering the Addams family mansion she lived in. It used to have a large family. I forget how many kids Aunt Lydia once had living there, but it was at least 3 at a time. I think she adopted kids too, but I'm not sure if that was before, after, or while she was raising her own biological offspring as well. There were rooms that had formerly been inhabited but were now mostly emptied out, and there were rooms with someone else's stuff still left in them. It would look like someone from 10 or 20 years ago was currently living right in that room and would walk through that door any moment to do their homework. I got the impression that once Aunt Lydia's kids left home, they really left. I wondered if any of them had ever come back to visit her, and if not, I wondered why not. Aunt Lydia and I weren't exactly best friends, and in truth I barely knew her, but she always seemed like a kind sort. Even having me out for Memorial Day weekend to endure a 13-year-old invading her quiet space, that seemed like an act of kindness to me even at the time. If it weren't for her, I'd have had to have gone with one of my parents off to be ignored and rescheduled by the animated corpse of my formerly loving guardian. I can hear you all out there. You're saying stop whining about your childhood and go take a walk in the forest. That's where the Dogman is. Well, yes, but no. I wasn't going for a walk the first time I saw Dogman out there. I was gazing out through the big window looking out on the back lawn. It was around dusk. We had just finished eating dinner. I was gazing out the window, watching the colors of the sky change, when I thought I saw something moving in the trees off in the distance. I would notice it peripherally, but when I would look directly at the spot, I couldn't be sure. I asked one of the servants if my aunt or uncle had any binoculars, and one of them brought me an antique-looking telescope. I aimed it quickly at the trees but saw nothing. I watched until dark, then realized it would be pointless to go any longer, so I made a mental note to be back at the telescope before dusk the following night. There would be fireworks just after sunset, being set off directly on the other side of this patch of forest and easily viewable from the picture window. That was my favorite part of each trip up here, the fireworks in the air over the forest. It looked like the beginning of the old Walt Disney Wonderful World of Color TV show, the magical and mythical beginning of summer. The next morning after breakfast, I walked the length of the yard and searched around for any kind of sign of someone or something having been there where I thought I saw something the night before. The ground was muddy, and I saw only one set of tracks, which were of a dog or cat, but very large. Not a house cat or pet dog, I thought. Then again, maybe footprints in the mud expand to make them look larger? I tried putting a boot print from my boot next to one of the paw prints, and I was disturbed to find out that the paw print came out about the same size in the end. How big was this dog or cat anyhow? It looked as though the animal had walked into the forest, so I naively wandered in to see if I could get close enough to get a look at the thing. I still wasn't sure what I was looking for. At that point, I was still assuming I had seen a four-legged creature out of my peripheral vision the night before. I had not seen it clearly enough to discern if it were even actually there, but these footprints seemed to say it was. Everywhere was muddy under the tree canopy, and I slipped almost immediately, catching myself on a tree trunk before I fell. It was extremely easy to follow the tracks, which is not a statement I had made before that day or ever again since. I'm not exactly a tracker, I'm a city boy, but on that day, those tracks stood out like they had been drawn in day-glow colors. I followed them, but as I mentioned already, I'm not a tracker. So at some point or another, I looked up and realized I had no idea where I was or how to get back to the house. I was starting to get hungry for lunch, but I had no idea what direction lunch might be in. Now, this stretch of forest I was lost in was a fairly narrow patch from Aunt Lydia's backyard over to the other side where the fireworks would be set off. That was maybe a 10-minute walk straight through the forest on a little dirt path. The forest, however, continued in two other directions for miles and widened almost immediately on either side, so you could get lost very quickly if you went any way other than on that one little dirt path. I stood in the forest, starting to panic a little, trying to remember if the fireworks were east of Aunt Lydia's house, or north, west maybe, or she was west and they were east. And then I heard a growling noise. It was really deep and vibrated my whole body. I looked around and around, spinning in a circle. I couldn't even tell which direction it was coming from. That was a very unsettling feeling to not know which direction a sound was coming from. It didn't make sense, and at that age, I was very literal. I was a kid, but I was growing up. This was like something unnatural or supernatural happening, and my mind had no place for that. The supernatural was only something from the movies. Then I saw the eye shine in the bushes, and all at once the sound was only coming from that one direction. I was now in danger of losing my life because of the angry looking eyes in the dark ahead, but at least I understood what direction the growl was coming from. If I were going to be eaten alive, it would at least be by a natural creature whose existence made logical sense. That mattered a lot to me for whatever reason. I guess I was sort of a materialist or a literalist back then. So when the eye shine in the bushes started to move up in the air, I felt that weird feeling in my belly again about how this was something that should not be happening, and things seemed all wrong all over again. The eyes rose above my line of vision and kept going. No, this creature could not be that tall. Then they went further up in the air and disappeared behind some leaves. Maybe it was flying away? Maybe those were birds' eyes and they were flying away? Except I knew they weren't. They were the binocular eyes of some kind of mammalian predator. And so, when the aforementioned predator walked forward and stared at me, I was at once both shocked and yet unsurprised as this dark, kangaroo-like dog towered over me and roared. When I say kangaroo-like, I mean it stood upright like a kangaroo and held its arms in front of itself and had very strong hind legs. It did not hop though, it walked and later ran, sort of like a human, but with the arms held out in front, not swinging as a human's arms do. It would run sort of bent over with its tail held out straight back, but that happened later. At this point it just towered over me, looking to see what I would do in reaction to its roar. I did nothing. I might have been in shock, or maybe I was just a very unoriginal kid, but I stood there, probably with my mouth open, unable to do anything at all. They say don't make eye contact with a strange dog, that it can enrage the animal. Well, I had made eye contact, nose contact, fangs contact, claws contact, and more because I looked that thing over a few times. I think my eyes were the only part of me even capable of moving. Until, that is, the creature took a step toward me. That's when I suddenly found myself running as fast as I could in the mud, trying to put some distance between myself and that thing. So what exactly was I running from? Well, it was covered in mud, as I was in the process of becoming as well while running from this monster. It was a hairy beast covered in long matted fur. It was taller than an adult man, even when bent over and running like a velociraptor from a Steven Spielberg movie. It had a long snout like a dog, but seemed different than any dog I had ever seen before. It had pointed dog ears that sat on top, but sort of further apart from each other than normal dog ears. They were sort of almost on the sides. It had a face like a pit bull, and the hair was very short around the face like that sort of dog, but it was dark in color and the snout was longer like Anubis from ancient Egypt. I remember a lot of running, and I remember feeling like I couldn't possibly go on, yet I also remember going on. It was a terrible day, just running and running from the creature. I finally climbed a tree that had a big nook in it about 18 feet off the ground. I laid back in the little saddle-shaped space and cried and panted until I had nearly caught my breath. I could hear the creature approaching through the foliage, but was literally too tired to even lift my head to look. I couldn't disguise my extreme panting and weeping either, so the canine monster could immediately see and hear me there. He settled in underneath me and began a sort of vigil. I guess he figured I had to come down eventually, and when I did, he would have lunch. I remember laying on my back watching the sky above me and hearing the creature breathing below me. I fell asleep from exhaustion and must have slept for an hour or so. I woke up, and the surprise of realizing I was in a tree and not in my bed almost caused me to slip off my branch and plummet to the earth. Recovering my balance, I laid back on the branch, too terrified to move a muscle for minutes or longer. I laid there until my back ached, and then I turned over and a chill went through me seeing the immense monster still down there below me. How long could that thing wait for me? How could something so large be walking around these woods so close to civilization and not be taught in school books? I used to get books about Bigfoot and monsters, and there had never been anything like this creature I was staring at, just a few feet underneath me. This was back in the 70s. We used to read paperback books from the Scholastic Book Club about Loch Ness Monster and so forth. I couldn't believe I was seeing a monster that had never been in any of those books. I was now realizing I had to go to the bathroom, and I was hungry too. I wasn't able to get down the tree without the Dogman grabbing me, and even if I managed to get away from him, I wondered which direction I should run in. Standing up, I climbed the last few branches in that tree which looked sturdy enough to support my weight, trying to get up as high as I could and maybe see the mansion. It was a no-go, as all I was able to really see from up there were more trees. I couldn't see the Dogman below me from the upper branches, so I felt safer up there. I relieved myself, then wondered if I could eat tree leaves to relieve hunger. I knew I might be there for a while, and started to think in the long term. The hungrier I got, the sadder I got. My life had gone from one long happy ending to a feeling like there would never be a happy ending again. Even if I somehow evaded getting torn apart by a monster werewolf thing, I would still never have my life back that I had once had. I would never have my happy home with my parents. I sort of became an adult that day, sitting in that tree trying to outwait the hunger of an apex predator, waiting for me to make one wrong step and slip out of that tree. And so the day went. The most boring day ever, and yet the most excruciating and stressful as well. I watched as the creature groomed itself for a while, then I climbed up higher in the tree as the sun went down. The higher I went, the more of the waning light I had. This was growing more terrifying by the moment. The creature had actually waited under me for a full afternoon. Trying to get away from it in the dark, when now I was weakened by hunger, would probably be even less likely than getting away in the sunlight had been. I wept for myself, thinking it was becoming more and more of a likelihood that this was going to be the night that I would die. I sat on my perch high in the tree, watching all the light fade from the sky and the stars come out. I knew the names of a few constellations, so I looked for them. It seemed so weird to me that this knowledge I had would soon disappear when I was eaten by the Dogman. Why do we learn things when we are so finite? We live our lives like we're preparing to live forever. Maybe we should live our lives like this was our final hour instead. And as I thought about that, I heard what sounded like muskets firing off in the distance. Then I heard and felt a big boom shake the tree, and I thought for a second, it's World War III. What a day, first Dogman, then the end of the world. But as I looked around me, I saw fireworks, and I remembered that this was Memorial Day. It was time for the fireworks. My first thought was, at least I can enjoy a good show before I die. But then adrenaline shot through me when I realized that, judging by the direction and distance of the fireworks, I was actually a lot closer to the mansion than I had thought. I scrambled down the tree as quietly as I could and peered down at the Dogman, who was wandering off curiously in the direction of the explosive noises. I never heard the monster again that night, and I even got to see the end of the fireworks from the picture window. The cook had saved me some dinner, and nobody even questioned where I'd been all day. I don't think I ever told any of them what happened to me because I didn't want to be told I had to stay out of the woods. It didn't matter either way, as I had to go and live with my mother starting the next morning anyhow. It was no fun growing up with my parents separated and with an inattentive and self-obsessed mom going through some weird series of personal crises. But I have to say that the Memorial Day and evening I spent convinced I was about to be eaten by a carnivorous two-legged dog brought me an ability to appreciate what I have in whatever moment I'm existing in. Enjoy what you've got because you don't know how much longer you're going to have it. And be grateful that no matter how bad your life might get, at least you're not being stalked by Dogman.
Get your Bigfoot for President t-shirts, mugs, buttons. Get them now. cafepress.com/Bigfoot for President.
Can I out-jog Dogman? As told to and read by Peter Bernard. I've been an avid jogger since the 1980s when I was in my 20s. I've jogged indoors, I've jogged outdoors, I've jogged through Harlem, I've jogged around a rooftop, and I've jogged out in the country. I've never been bothered by anyone except for this one time I almost got chased to death by Dogman. My business used to send me out to work with a client in Ontonagon, Wisconsin for weeks at a time. I used to request a room in Silver City right on this little triangle of land overlooking Union Bay. In the mornings, I would get up when it was still dark out and jog a half hour west in the direction of the Porcupine Mountains Visitor Center. On Saturdays and Sundays, I'd get up even earlier and run the entire 50 minutes or an hour to the Visitor Center, then rehydrate and jog on back along the 107th Engineers Memorial Highway. One weekday morning, I ended up running the entire way to Porcupine Mountain, but I had not planned to. My schedule got changed by Dogman. I remember my mind was preoccupied as I was jogging westward that morning. One of the people I worked with was having a birthday and I hadn't decided on a present yet. Now it had to be something I could get before 9 a.m., so that narrowed my choices in that area at that time immensely. As I was passing a driveway leading to a house built back in the woods, I looked and I saw a werewolf. I was so lost in my own personal trivial thoughts that I looked back in front of me and kept jogging for a second or two before it registered what I had seen. I must have made a classic old-school Hollywood double-take because I drew the attention of the werewolf and it locked eyes with me. I screamed like a little schoolgirl and ran westward. That was a stupid way to run since there wasn't going to be anything for a long time, and it wasn't going to start getting light for another hour. When I realized I should be running back to the hotel, I turned and looked behind me and I saw it was too late. The Dogman was behind me. And so the dumbest and weirdest slow-speed chase until OJ was underway. I had first ran at my full speed, but the Dogman kept pace about 20 feet behind. When I tired out and slowed a bit, he slowed down too, maintaining the same distance. He was toying with me. I didn't know what to do except to continue to run. Maybe he would eat me, or maybe he would get bored and go away. If only a car would drive by, maybe they could rescue me. I guess I should explain what I mean when I say werewolf or dogman in this story. It was a man-shaped animal with a dog's head. It was covered by fur. It was taller than I am, and I'm 6'1", but it was not supernaturally tall by any means. I don't think it was 7 feet, maybe 6'6". It had tall ears on top of its head that told you at once you were not looking at a mask. They moved with the dog's changing expression. This was a man, except its head was a dog's head. I get asked about backwards legs, and I don't really know what that means, but it sounds very creepy. I don't really remember the guy's legs except that he was ripped. He was like a bodybuilder with a tail, basically. I was giving it my all to stay in front of him, but he wasn't even getting out of breath. There's a patch over there where the highway runs right up next to the water. That's when the Dogman chose to catch up to me. He ran on all fours and snipped at my heels. He made me run faster, and he directed where I should run. He was herding me, basically, and he herded me right into the bay. Then he sat there, tongue hanging out, looking all proud of himself. I really wished a car would drive by. The water was icy cold, and I wanted to get out, but whenever I would get near the shore, the Dogman would leap in front of me and growl or snap at me to get me back in the frigid water. He seemed to think this was funny. I almost wondered if he was going to steal my school money when he swung hard at me, pushing me back in the water, some of which I inhaled by accident. Now I was choking and heading further out in the water so that he didn't hit me again while I was gasping for air. I was now in it up to my waist, both literally and figuratively. After I'd composed myself, I looked back on the shore and watched the Dogman watching me. I wasn't going to do anything until he was. And then he did. He just left. I saw him turn around, stand up on his hind legs, and just casually stroll into the forest. I waited a little while to make sure he was gone, then as quietly as I could, I waded ashore and started to run back toward the hotel. I was extremely cold and worried about my internal body temperature when out of nowhere, the Dogman burst out of the bushes to my right and was standing only about 60 or 70 feet in front of me. I turned and ran back toward the west and the water. Was he just going to throw me back in again? Was he going to do something worse to me this time? I found my internal body temperature rising as I ran as quickly as I had ever run. The rest of the story was terrifying to live through, but there were no major landmark moments after that. The thing literally chased me for over a half hour more until I got near the turnoff for the visitor's center and flagged down a ranger driving by. He took me for first aid and medical attention, and I got out of it unscathed and made it to work on time. But it came very close to having a very different kind of ending, thanks to Dogman. Dogman fan versus Bigfoot fan, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. Dear Scary Stories, I just want to say up front, I don't believe all the stories on your channel. Some of them are true because I can tell, but some of them are not because I can tell that too. Anyhow, this is a story about a guy I used to know who was a huge Bigfoot fan. He was huge in a few different ways, including being somewhat overweight. He was also extremely gullible and believed any Bigfoot expert who said that they are gentle woodland apes, shy and retiring creatures. I maintain that Bigfoot are primates, so they must be capable of nearly all the same behaviors as humans. Some humans will help you when you're on hard times, while other humans will hide in dark places and sneak up behind you to snatch you. Bigfoot are capable of doing all these things and many others as well. To go in the forest looking for Bigfoot is like going into a prison hoping to attract murderers. Not that all Bigfoot are murderers, of course, but assuming they are real, they can snap us like twigs. I argued to my friend that Dogman followers are far more realistic and intelligent about cryptids, and he cut me off, saying there was more proof of Bigfoot than Dogman, so therefore his side was the more serious and mature side. I argued that he believed in the Bigfoot from TV commercials, and that's a childish worldview. He would use terms like squatchy and generally had a cartoonish way of interpreting reality. So one day he was out at my place in the country. Well, okay, it's in the suburbs, but it's next to some woods. I convinced the guy that I had seen Sasquatch in these woods, and he was all excited to go out there with his fancy camera and other junk. So I bring him out there one night at dusk, and I swear we're not 10 minutes into the forest, and I turn around behind me and the guy is gone. I searched around for like 10 minutes in that area, and then I hear a strange cry that I thought might have been him further out in the woods. I ran in that direction for a while until I heard the same sound from back where I had started running. Heading back, I got the distinct impression I was surrounded out there by someone or a group of someones. I just trudged back to my place to call the authorities and notify them that my friend was missing. I felt truly bad. I had wanted to pull the guy's leg and now he was missing. On top of that, I might be the next to go. My face was bright red out of both embarrassment and fear. I finally made it out of the woods into the yard behind my house. I was in the home stretch, and at least I was about to get myself to safety, even if my poor friend was still out there alone. That's when I got hit in the back of the head by a pebble or an acorn. I screamed like a kindergartner and I raced home. Turning around, I saw them. I saw two huge men. I knew there were more than that, but I saw the silhouettes of two immense bull Sasquatches that night. It lasted half a second, but it was the most terrifying thing you could ever imagine seeing. I ran inside and slammed the door behind me, locking it. Relieved and panting to catch my breath, I turned around to see my friend. There, in my room, sitting in a chair looking confused and not wearing any of his clothes. No, he did not know how he got there, and no, he did not remain an innocent Bigfoot fan after that. In fact, he gave up the hobby entirely, and I lost touch with him a few years back. So that's my story about how Dogman fans are smarter than Bigfoot fans. If you want to hear about the time I saw Dogman myself, let me know and I'll write it up for you. A real, natural Dogman. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. Y'all have stories about people falling in love with Dogman or transforming into werewolves. When that kind of stuff happens, that's demons and the supernatural. You shouldn't lump Dogman in with that kind of stuff because Dogman is a natural animal like a bear or a mountain lion or you and me. And they're not a recent thing neither. My great-grandpa saw one. He got knocked down by one. It seems great-granddaddy got in between the Dogman and some kind of pheasant he was chasing for lunch. Dogman might not be in the science books yet, but it's only a matter of time. The demons and the kinds of Dogman that a lady could fall in love with, none of these things will ever end up in science or history books because they are from another reality that is dipping into ours in the ways described by Albert Einstein that we've all seen on TV shows. The real, actual, natural Dogman is born in this reality, same as you and me, lives its entire life in this reality, killing and maiming and causing all kinds of evil like a demon, but he is not actually a demon. Now that I have made my point clear, I will tell you about the one time I actually saw a Dogman with my own eyes. I was out in the back of the house looking to get out of my chores. I couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old, so I'm sitting there trying to keep quiet so I could just digest dinner for a while instead of cleaning up dishes. All of a sudden, this thing, this hyena-like big bear dog, just walks around the house to where I'm sitting. Like la-di-da, you know? I don't know where he came from, but it was the direction of the driveway, right? So anyway, the hyena monster sees me and wham, it stands straight up at attention on its hind legs. So I'm thinking mutated bear, but then the thing, I swear, it starts barking at me. But the deepest barks I ever heard in my life. I ran inside so loud I interrupted my parents watching TV and they ordered me to clean up the kitchen. I tried to tell them there was a were hyena out on the back porch, but that only got them angry and Dad got out of his chair. When he got up, that meant bad trouble, so I started washing dishes as quickly as I could and the Dogman was never spoken of again. But it was real, and I saw it, and it probably would have bitten me if I hadn't run inside. It wasn't supernatural, it was just weird. It's a rare creature, but it is a creature. And that's the truth, as I have seen it with my own two eyes. Bunny Ears, the Dogman, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. My kid had been telling me for a year that he was seeing Dogman in our backyard, and I shrugged it off because Dogman is the name of a popular children's book series. When he began calling him Bunny Ears the Dogman, I figured this must be some specific and particular version of the archetype, but I still assumed it was my boy imagining a benign cartoon character. But when our neighbor fell ill and Billy told us it was Bunny Ears the Dogman who had made her get sick, we knew something was wrong, and we had to immediately find out what. My wife and I are not poor, but we sacrificed a lot to get Billy in front of some competent psychiatric personnel and figure out exactly what was going on. When Billy was saying the Dogman made the lady next door sick, did he mean he himself did something to hurt her in some way? Billy just kept repeating the same story. Bunny Ears didn't like our neighbor because she once killed a rabbit that ate her vegetables, so he made her sick because he has powers like that. The shrinks were unable to find anything really wrong with Billy except that he had a delusion about a giant dog-headed man with magic powers that only he could see. Nothing crazy about that. Well, in all honesty, for his age there really isn't. So, my kid had an invisible superpowered giant bunny-eared friend with magic powers. It reminded me of Jimmy Stewart and Harvey, except Harvey never got revenge on people by sending them to the emergency room. So then, one night, I saw him. I saw Harvey, or Bunny Ears. He had tall ears for a dog, but they were dog ears. I had to agree with my son, though. He was a dog man. So I was putting the garbage in the cans around the back of the house by the shack in the woods, and I heard something in the bushes. I decided to hurry since whatever it was made me feel very uncomfortable. I heard it moving around clearly enough to tell it had to be something large. I wasn't surprised to see a dog head poking around from behind the back of the old wooden shed, but I was pretty surprised to see one that large and that high off the ground. It had to be as tall as I was, and all sorts of alarm bells went off inside me. Then it walked out from behind the garage, and it really was the largest dog on earth. I saw it walk out on all fours, and it might have been 7 feet at the shoulder. Then it started standing up on its hind legs, and I didn't stick around to see how tall he would end up then. I booked it back in the house, where I quietly informed my wife of what I had just experienced, and she believed me. I was shaken up pretty badly, and she could tell I wouldn't make up a story like that. So we went to a motel the next day, and we were formally in a new dwelling before the month was out. I felt bad that I didn't understand what my son was actually trying to tell me for so long. He doesn't seem to have been traumatized by it, he just saw it as a natural occurrence. My wife asked him if he thought Bunny Ears was angry that we moved away, and he said no. He can come visit us in our dreams if he gets lonely. Great. So now there's that to look forward to. If you ask me whether Dogman is real or supernatural, I will side with the latter. There's no way an actual natural creature that tall is roaming the woods. Maybe some of what are seen are real animals, but that's certainly not what I saw. What I saw was something out of a nightmare in a quite literal sense. So, scary, freakish, overly giant monster Dogman, let's not meet again. Dogman, Locked in the Basement, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. When I was a kid in the late 1960s, my brother and I were left off at my Uncle Jed's house one summer for some reason that was never explained to us. Uncle Jed lived out in the country, just sitting there and watching TV all day. I don't know what he did for a living or how he paid his bills, but he provided us with as much breakfast cereal as we wanted, and anything else we'd have to find a way to earn money to buy it ourselves. So we mowed every lawn in the area and bought ourselves a lot of cold cuts, since the only food we knew how to make besides cereal was sandwiches. My brother kept asking if we should go ask the house in the forest if he wanted his lawn mowed, and I kept not knowing what he was talking about. Then one day, after we had mowed everyone else's lawn and done just about everything we could think of to earn $1, he led me out to the house. Wow, it was spooky. It didn't even look like it belonged there. It was a house literally in the woods. There was a dirt path leading up to it, but no driveway. We knocked on the front door but got no answer. After milling around for a while, we started to look inside the house. It seemed lived in. There was a tablecloth on the table and a glass bowl with fruit in it. I wondered if they were real or plastic. We wandered around the back and knocked again, but once again got no response. This place is creepy, I informed my brother, who shrugged me off and continued walking around the other side of the house. It was there that we saw the window into the basement. We had to bend over to look into it, and we both really couldn't believe what we saw on the other side of that glass. It was a monster chained up in the basement. "Is that real?" I gasped, and my eyes saw the monster turn and look directly at me. My heart almost exploded and I fell backward. The monster lunged at me, but its chains clanked loudly as they reached their limit a few inches from the window. The thing was snarling furiously, trying to get out of its bonds and at me and my brother. We ran home and made sandwiches, then went outside to eat and discuss what had just happened. "What was that thing?" I asked. My brother was cool about it. "It was a projection, like at Disneyland." I thought for a second and I realized he must mean the haunted mansion, where they project ghosts onto hidden translucent screens and they appear to be right there in the room next to you. I was unimpressed with his theory. "So you're saying some guy in the woods set up an elaborate Disneyland monster show that you could only see out of one of his basement windows in a house that nobody ever walks past?" He responded angrily, "Do you have a better explanation?" I did. It was a real monster. Now let me pause and describe exactly what we saw. It seemed to be a man, yet it was entirely covered in hair with no clothing. It was wild and savage, uncivilized, and growled and snarled rather than speaking. The most striking thing about it was that its nose and upper mouth were extended like a dog's snout, and its nose looked at the end much like a dog or wolf's nose. The eyes had hardly any white in them, looking more like an animal's eyes than a human's. Both of us decided to go back there and have another look. This time we brought a flashlight with us since it was starting to get dark. When we got back to the window, the creature inside freaked out once again, trying to tear itself away from the wall it was chained to. We could see with the flashlight that the fur around the animal's wrists and ankles was gone, rubbed away by the restraints on him. He must have been here for a while, but he was also very active and strong, so whoever was holding him here was making sure he was getting his vitamins. The more we stared at it and shined our light in, the more we agitated the creature, which made me feel badly. I didn't feel like I had any choice though. I had an intense curiosity that needed to be satisfied, and I needed to know what this was and if it could be real. There's no way that's a projection, I informed my brother. It never repeats any of its actions. If it were an animation, it would loop eventually. This thing didn't look like an animation, especially not a 1960s animation. Maybe something like that could be created with computers, but they did animation by hand or with puppets back then, and this was no cartoon or puppet. It was such a strange looking creature that I wish I had greater powers to describe things. It did not look like a normal man or a normal dog. It would have been a weird one of either species. Its eyes were set too far apart for one thing. We watched as the animal started gnawing at his chains, and I said we should leave. I couldn't see if he was trying to bite the chain off or his own wrist, and I convinced my brother we had bothered this creature enough. He didn't want to leave, but it was fairly dark now, and I suggested we come back the next day with our uncle's camera and try to get some photos for the National Enquirer. Maybe they would pay us something, then we could get more cold cuts. So then the next day we came back and the monster was missing from the basement. We could see the chains there still bolted into the wall and the concrete floor. We both gasped at the monster not being there, looking around nervously. Had he gotten out? We never did figure out what he was eating. I wanted to run home, but my brother persuaded me to wait a bit while he scouted around. Looking inside the first floor, we saw that the tablecloth and other things were gone from inside. It looked like whoever lived here had moved out in a hurry. I guess they took the Dogman monster with them. We ran home asking our uncle who owned that house. He didn't even know what house we meant. I doubt he'd strayed more than 12 feet from the boob tube since he'd moved here. We didn't know anyone else in the area, and we didn't know you could look things like land ownership up at City Hall or the library, so we felt stymied. Out of lawns to mow, and with our Dogman monster missing, we were out of prospects for raising cash, and we got on the phone to beg for some food money from our parents. When they heard that Uncle Jed was only giving us one meal a day and forcing us to scavenge like rats, my father was out there later in the day to pick us up. We told him excitedly about the Dogman in the basement, hoping he might know more about the subject than our uncle. He just looked at us like we had brain damage from lack of adequate diet. I can't say for certain that he was wrong. And that's the last time I ever saw a monster in my life, excluding certain lawyers and politicians I've encountered. I'm fortunate that it was trapped and I could examine it from a safe distance. I would never ever want to encounter something like a Dogman in the wild. And for that reason, I've developed a career where I can work in the city. Because the one thing you can be sure of never running into inside a city is Dogman. Dogman Face in the Window. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. When I was a kid, my mother got in a car accident and I was left with my Aunt Sylvia, who had grown very eccentric, living alone away from the rest of the family. She had a house in the country with these very small windows in it. It was dark inside and stuffy. The windows were no larger than an adult human head and the bottoms opened to let in air. As a consequence, the ventilation was atrocious and the rooms were dim. It was a very old house, so it wasn't as though she had built it that way herself. Yet it was a place that seemed to suit my crazy Aunt Sylvia. One night I asked her outright why the windows were so small there. She said she would explain after dinner. That evening she made a fire in the fireplace and shared some strange tasting tea with me, and she began to tell me the story. Generations and generations ago, the founder of our family line struck it rich. He bought this land and had a small house built to live in while he constructed this mansion, which was to be where he intended to raise a family. Everything went well the first few weeks, but in his third living in the small house, he had a horrible encounter with what he described as a werewolf. This made me laugh out loud. I thought she was joking. She was about to tell me a story about a werewolf. All along I thought this was going to be some serious history about our family, but she was leading up to a story about a monster. I figured Aunt Sylvia had a batty sense of humor, but she sure had gotten me reeled in this time. Then I noticed she wasn't laughing along with me. In fact, Aunt Sylvia looked sort of hurt and confused. So, she was serious about a werewolf living around here? More than just one, silly, she responded. It takes 2 werewolves to have a werewolf baby, so that he can meet a lady werewolf and make another werewolf baby, And then I interrupted the birds and bees lecture to make sure I was hearing this correctly. So the official family historical story about why this big old house has such tiny windows is because there were werewolves living in this area in those days? Oh, not just in those days, Aunt Sylvia corrected me. I never said anything about them moving away. Okay, now I was utterly weirded out. Not so much by the idea of werewolves living in the surrounding area, since I didn't believe in werewolves, but mainly I was weirded out that I was going to have to live with this crazy lady for another few weeks before my mom would be well enough to move home. So she went on telling me story after story after story about these creatures she called werewolves and their adventures, trying to capture my ancestor's dog, trying to steal food from the root cellar, and once attacking our great-great-great-uncle from behind for no apparent reason. One creature broke in through a house window one night and wrecked a lot of things. By then our ancestor had run into some hard luck and was running short on funds. He couldn't afford to move since nobody would buy his land now that they knew werewolves were on it. So he spent what he could to reinforce the doors and to install smaller unbreakable windows that the animals couldn't get through. Had any of these creatures ever attacked a person, I asked, suddenly realizing I was starting to buy into all this nonsense. If anyone has been attacked by one of these monsters, Aunt Sylvia said, he or she never lived to tell the rest of us about it. Okay. One day Aunt Sylvia had me doing some work with her in the large basement, which was a series of rooms and tunnels. In the corner of one large room was what appeared to be a cemetery. I asked her about it, sort of horrified. She told me it was real, an actual pet cemetery. Okay, I was wondering the same thing you are now wondering. Why were these pets buried downstairs inside the house? And Aunt Sylvia told me that the dog people would dig them up if they were buried outside. So, the werewolves were dog people. They weren't just mythical killing machines that lived by night. They were literally dog people. So they weren't just nightmares, they were flesh and blood. They did some things like people and some things like dogs, and they dug up the recently dead. I shuddered, feeling creeped out by these werewolf things. They were gross and nasty as far as I was concerned. I wasn't just scared of them, I was kind of disgusted by them too, and I wasn't even sure if they were real yet. If they weren't real, then what other explanation for the tiny windows here? Maybe this entire line of my family was just insane. Maybe it's something in the water up here? If that was it, then each day I stayed there, I might be heading closer to insanity myself. I knelt down and inspected the little pet cemetery. Well, if I was going to go crazy, this certainly seemed like the perfect place for it. That night I had the strangest dream. I was trying to start a car engine and it kept making a whining sound, then failing. Over and over again, I turned the key in the ignition. The car would loudly make sputtering sounds and snarling whines, then silence again. People in my dream were getting impatient with me, and I defended myself by pointing out that I was just a kid and I don't drive. The logic of that suddenly made me realize I was dreaming, and that woke me up. The thing is, after I woke up, I still heard the strange snarling, whining sound. Where was it coming from, and what was it? I sat up, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes, and looked around. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. I was about to go back to sleep when I heard the sound again, accompanied by scratching. The dog wants to be let out, I thought, and I staggered to my feet to go see what needed to be done. I nearly fell over sideways. I was so off balance from just waking up. I wandered toward the kitchen, then remembered, there are no dogs living in that house. And if there were, Aunt Sylvia certainly wouldn't let them out in the night since she believed werewolves haunted the neighborhood. Werewolves. The sound of the dog whining and scratching. Maybe it wasn't a dog trying to get out of the house. Maybe it's a dog trying to get in. I started shivering as though I had frostbite. All blood drained from me. I wanted to go back to bed and pull the covers over my head. I ran back toward my room but passed the first floor bathroom on the way there. I saw something peripherally in that bathroom that made me grind to a halt a few steps past the bathroom door. I thought I saw something that made no sense. I could hear the dog whine sound and the scratching coming from the bathroom. That's definitely the center of the noise. I backpedaled slowly a couple of steps and peered inside. What I saw was just so impossible, and yet I was 70 or 80% certain I wasn't dreaming. What I saw was a small bit of glass spattered on the ground and the nose of a dog trying to force its way through the tiny window. Sometimes the nose would withdraw and claws would scrape at the frame, trying to widen it so that the creature could gain entry into the house. I felt like I was in a surrealist or Dada movie and I wanted to see the special effect close up. So I walked over to the wall and with a snarling werewolf apparently trying to break through it, I walked directly to the wall and I leaned on it. I could see the snout of the creature now in 3 dimensions. I could see it in profile. I could see its immense size and fangs up close. I could smell the smell of death in its breathing and I knew that this had to be real. Unless I was now dreaming in smell-o-vision, this was some sort of actual canine creature trying to break through into the house. I remembered back to when I was a kid when we lived in a house with mice. One time I saw a mouse's tail protrude from a hole in a windowsill. I at first didn't know what it was. Then I realized there had to be a mouse inside the windowsill, and it didn't know that its tail was exposed. I could see a tiny healed cut on the mouse's tail and suddenly empathized with him. I didn't want to cause him any harm, so I tapped lightly on the sill to let him know I was there, and he moved away, showing some of his white and brown fur through the crack in the wood as he departed. This was a situation like that, except the creature this time was in all likelihood larger than I was, and it would be me that might get hurt, not the creature on the other side of the crack in the wood. Speaking of which, I heard a cracking noise, and I saw that the window frame was in fact beginning to break. Could the creature actually force its way into the house? I ran upstairs to Aunt Sylvia's bedroom. I tried to wake her, but nothing I did worked, and she kept on snoring. Looking out her window, I saw we were directly above the bathroom window below. I could see the back of the creature now, with its head stuck further into the window frame than earlier. This was a huge man or beast. It had broad shoulders and it was pitch black all over. It was shaped like a man, but definitely had an animal head. I could see now why my aunt would call this a werewolf. To me, though, it was some kind of a dog creature, and I had to get it to stop before it broke through that window and got into the house. I looked around for heavy stuff and ended up dropping all my aunt's potted plants out the window onto the creature's back. One by one I dropped them, larger each time. The creature pulled its head out of the hole in the wall, looked directly up at me, and roared. The werewolf seemed angrier than ever, and it started trying to climb the aluminum siding of the house to get up at the window I was in. Panicking, I dropped the one remaining plant, a large cactus I could barely even get onto the window ledge. I tipped it over and wham! I could feel it hit something large down below. The dogman squealed and ran away, whimpering from what just happened. I saw it go into the woods and I nearly fainted from relief. Aunt Sylvia was still not awake, so I just locked her door for protection and slept in a chair as well as I could until the sun came up. I got out of there the next day, talking a friend of mine from school into letting me stay over for a night just to get out, then finding a different relative to stay with the rest of the time until my mom was okay again. Aunt Sylvia is weird, but she's not a bad person. However, I'm just not cut out to handle the stress of living in the same neighborhood as Dogman. Dogman in the Morning, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. I want to tell you a story about a dog-headed bipedal animal that invaded our property where my wife and I used to live a few years back. We had intended to live at that house until our dying days, but we got chased off by this critter, whatever it was. Here's the story, starting from the beginning. My wife started telling me she had a werewolf friend since back when I was finishing up my last few months at my old job. We moved out to the country in anticipation of my retirement when I still had about a half a year to go of working before my pension would kick in and I could relax and go on permanent vacation. We were both very happy that we had our place in the country that we'd been talking about since we were married, heck, even before. This was our lifelong dream fulfilled, or so we thought. Anyway, she would tell me about her werewolf friend, and I didn't really know what to make of it. I was extremely preoccupied by doing my job, training my replacement, and driving an extra 2 hours almost every day just for the privilege of doing all this work, so I have to admit I wasn't entirely focused on what she was saying. My attitude at the time was, just let me get through these last few months, then my wife can have 100% of my attention until the day I die. By the time I actually retired and was finally feeling like I was living at our new home full time, the stories about my wife's werewolf had grown more elaborate. Now she was buying dog food in addition to cat food, and she was leaving the dog food out by the edge of the forest for her pet werewolf. Now she had my full attention, and I wondered if she was all right. I discreetly made an appointment to have her examined, and I was genuinely concerned she was developing something that was going to affect her mind. It was a terrible time for me right then, worrying about her, but eventually she got a clean bill of health, and it turns out her nervous system was the equivalent of that of a much younger person. She truly is a wonder even to this day. Now I was confused. If my wife wasn't having mental or emotional problems and her brain was fine, her internal circuitry fully intact, then what was this whole thing about a werewolf that she was leaving food for? I decided that rather than stay in bed after she got up in the morning, I'd pretend to be asleep, then follow her and watch what happened to see for myself what the story really was. Every day I saw her putting food out, but I never saw anything eat from the bowl. It was, however, always empty when she'd retrieve it at night to give her werewolf some dinner. I decided I wanted to get a game camera and set it up on the bowl so I could see what was eating the food. When I got back from town and walked over to set up the camera, my wife ran over to ask me what I was doing. After I explained, she was horrified and adamant that I not frighten off her werewolf. She was certain he would not want to be photographed and would avoid the food. She told me that if I put the game camera there, she would simply feed the animal in a different location. I was truly stunned at her animosity and her devotion to this supposed animal, and I went right back to wondering about her mental state. Sometimes doctors make mistakes, you know. Maybe this was one of those times. Our cat Fifi had always lived indoors in apartments, and when we first moved out there, she was terrified of the outside. She adapted quickly though, and my wife would let the cat out to sleep in the yard while she tended her garden. Soon Fifi would ask to go out on her own, and we installed a little cat door for her. It opened when her collar approached, but in theory shouldn't let any other kinds of animals in. My wife and my pet were very happy, but I was still very confused and more than a little worried. One night I heard a terrible sound and I ran outside. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but I knew it was not good. When I saw Fifi come tearing out of the woods, I realized it had been her screeching. I stood there with the back door open for her, although she could have used the kitty door. She was running fine, and although clearly frightened, and with all her fur standing out on end, she appeared uninjured. She sped past me into the house, and then the thing that had been chasing her emerged from the woods in a rough and violent manner, growling and throwing spit all around as it panted for air, its chest heaving, head looking from side to side all over the lawn until it spotted me and stopped. It was what my wife had been talking about. It must be. Just then, she rushed out the door and held me from behind, asking in a concerned manner if I knew why Fifi just ran and hid in her closet. I didn't have to answer, because I could feel her tense up as she saw it looking furiously at us. The thing she called a werewolf. Judging by her reaction, she had never seen it angry before. She was seeing it angry now, though. This was a ridiculously large animal, like something out of a computer-generated monster movie made for basic cable. It had to be over 7 feet tall. The thing looked more like an optical illusion than anything that could possibly be real. First of all, it had cute little ears like a Scottish terrier up on top of this sort of pit bull kind of a face, only dark. Imagine a dark pit bull. The snout was much longer than a normal pit bull, though, and the eyes shone bright red as though it had been up all night cramming for an exam and we interrupted it. I don't really remember noticing the paws or the hands. I was only watching its face to gauge what it might do next. I don't know how a dog could walk on its hind legs, but this one did, and it looked very natural doing it. It didn't appear like a dog doing a magic trick. It was an animal that walked bipedally, sort of like a man and sort of like a chimp, but not really like either. It would stand up straight at its tallest when still, but would bend over and hold its arms in front of it when it advanced or retreated. I don't really remember much about the fur, although it was generally dark. I could sum up my impression of the thing as, this is something that could eat me for lunch, and then go off looking for dessert. If my wife hadn't had so much prior experience with this so-called werewolf, I would have insisted she go back inside immediately. As it was, I hoped her presence might calm the animal. It didn't. The immense beast leaned forward and screamed at us. It was like a bark and a howl and a moan. It was just horrible and painful. I heard my wife start crying. She had thought she had been bonding with one of God's creatures, but she had just been used by something straight out of hell. When that thing screamed, it sort of flung its head from side to side to emphasize its fury and frustration. Then it slowly began to back off into the forest again, keeping its eye on us the whole time to make sure we didn't follow. It seemed to be as afraid of me as I was of it. That was a good thing to notice. I wouldn't expect it to stay afraid of me for long though, as I didn't have any real weapons in the house, and I'm not actually a threat to even harm a fly. As soon as that dog-headed gorilla man realized that, it might not be any more afraid of me than it was of our cat Fifi. So needless to say, we kept that cat indoors 100% of the time after that, and my wife gave the dog food away to some neighbors who had a Great Dane. We gave up our dream home, which sold quickly as we only wanted to make back our original investment, and we were out of there in about 6 weeks, moving into the gated retirement community we currently reside in. We never saw the Dogman again after that day though, so maybe he got the message and cleared out of there. Either way, that property is for a younger couple. My wife and I want to lower our defenses on our remaining years, not raise them. We have an electric fence around the new property so Fifi can roam safely outside in our yard, and my wife has an even larger garden now. We no longer are surrounded by the forest as we were at the last place, and maybe that's okay with us. The way my wife puts it is, now we can rest and relax under a tree knowing that we are fenced in and protected by armed security the way God intended it. She has a weird sense of humor. All I know is, I'm glad I no longer have to share my backyard with Dogman. Dogman at Midnight. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. One summer when I was a teenager, my family had a house in New York State near Binghamton. That's upstate, about 3 hours north of the city. It's fairly developed up there, but it can get a lot like the country very fast when you get out of the city proper. It's a really nice place for that reason. Schools, modern city life, then rustic and quiet just a 5-minute drive away. I really liked it there and was sad when my father's job got transferred and we had to move to Arizona where it was hot all the time. Nothing against Arizona, but when you're a teenager forced to move somewhere against your will, any place can seem like a prison. So the house had a nice backyard swallowed up by the forest on 3 sides. We had a living room or TV room downstairs, and since I had no school, I would stay up late all summer watching TV while my parents slept upstairs. One night right around midnight, I saw something moving outside the window. It was tall and light-colored, like an abominable snowman as played by a basketball player, and it moved from left to right across my field of vision. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but I sprang up and ran to the window, staring out in the darkness. It was gone, whatever it was. I went back to watching TV, planning on talking about it in the morning with my parents. By then, though, it seemed like a dumb thing to bring up. They started breakfast off with a lecture about how I should get a job or something. They were always trying to give me a stomachache over every meal. They always had some complaint about how I was failing them as a son. So I kept the info about the thing I saw to myself, not wanting to give them any more ammunition to hurt me with. That night I saw the thing again, but I was a bit more prepared for it. I got to the window in time to see it walk into the trees on the right, and I saw it fairly well from behind. I think the only reason I was seeing it at all was that it was so light-colored. It was a furry, but covered in silver or white fur. I really thought it was a man in a costume, and it kind of scared the crap out of me as to why someone would put on a white furry monster costume and walk around the woods. This guy came from a patch of woods that I know stretched at least 5 minutes in that direction, because I had walked 5 minutes that way before giving up one day. Pretty much the same for the side he exited in. There was no other property in that direction for probably about the equivalent of 3 city blocks. So this was not only a guy in a furry suit, this was a weird guy in a furry suit. I hadn't noticed the time of night when I saw it that time, but by the next morning I was thinking it had to have been also around midnight. So this night at 11:45 I was ready, standing guard, sitting by the window on the floor waiting to see what I would see. Right at 11:55, there it was, walking out of the forest with a serious gait. It had a dog's head or a wolf's head. It was not a cartoony mask, though, as I was expecting to see. This was not a furry. This was a guy in a monster costume. When it took its second step, I could see that it either had the strangest boots in the world on, or it had deformed feet, because its legs looked like devil legs or dog legs. The way it walked was sort of like a man, but bent over a bit, and the legs just functioned differently. I guess it was sort of like if you walked on your tiptoes. It kind of looked like it was creeping along. It looked extra evil in that sense, and step, 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 it was gone into the forest on the right. 5 steps in a steady 4/4 disco beat, bam, 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 and gone. I was now in a kind of shock. I had been seeing a white werewolf or a white wolf or dog maybe, but one that walked on its hind legs. It really looked like an actual animal. It didn't look like a man in a suit. I could hardly sleep that night, and at the first rays of dawn I was out in the backyard looking for footprints. I was disappointed that the ground was hard and I couldn't see anything. I tried to make tracks myself, but even stamping on the ground left no real mark. Disappointed, I was about to go back inside when I got an idea. The creature had taken 5 steps to go from one side of the yard to the other. I wondered how many steps it would take me. I found what looked like the path through the woods that the dog creature had walked out of and estimated at what point I would have been able to see it from the window. Then I took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps, and I wasn't even 1/3 of the way across the yard. That couldn't be right. So I went back and this time took the biggest, longest steps that I could. I still wasn't even halfway across the yard. How did that dog get across so fast? It made no sense to me until after lunch. I suddenly understood. The creature was large. I hadn't really been able to judge its size from the window in the dark. The thing must be much, much larger than I had realized. I had to try to get a picture of this animal, or whatever it was. I spent money I couldn't afford to get film from my camera. This was years before digital cameras and cell phones. I had a little pocket camera, and I thought I could get a photo of it in the dark with that. Yeah, right. I did snap off a shot as the monster walked across the yard that night, but it came out black. Nothing there. The next night I decided to use the flash on the camera and try again. This time I photographed the glare off the window and part of my own reflection. This wasn't working out. I needed to get more drastic or I was not going to capture evidence of what I was witnessing. I had no choice left but to talk to my father about what was going on. He, of course, kept turning the conversation to why I was up at midnight instead of sleeping so I could go to my job in the morning. I tried to bring it back to the Dogman monster and he would say, "Oh, that's right, you're not in bed at night to get up for your job in the morning because you're too lazy to have a job in the morning to go to," and that sort of thing. I was persistent though, and eventually he started to realize I wasn't backing off on this. I wanted his help or his permission to set up a big light in the yard that I could turn on from inside the TV room. When the creature emerged from the bushes, if I turned on the light, hopefully it would freeze for a second, then I could get my shot. Dad listened attentively, then asked me seriously what drugs I was on. He wouldn't take me seriously at all, saying that he only takes adults seriously and he can tell who is an adult based on who has a job to go to in the morning. Always back to the same thing. He said he would stay up with me that night and he wanted to see the supposed white werewolf for himself. All day long, he and Mom kidded me about my abominable Dogman and the white wolf man, really enjoying themselves at my expense. So that night, right on time at 11:59, there he was. The incredibly huge white monster of a thing, like a Sasquatch with pointed ears on top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it was gone. I looked at my father to see his reaction. He was sitting right on his butt like someone had punched him in the stomach and knocked the wind out of him. His eyes were wide, and he didn't move for like 20 seconds. I was starting to get scared when he just got up, straightened himself out, and walked upstairs to bed. The next morning, he refused to talk about it at breakfast. Then he and Mom left together in the car, and I turned on the TV to watch cartoons. When they returned, they had the hugest dog I had ever, the hugest 4-legged dog I had ever seen with them. It was a pit bull mixed with something else. It looked like a mutant pit bull from a dystopian future-type science fiction film. I wasn't sure if Dad got that dog to eat the werewolf or to eat us. The only thing I knew was that that dog was going to eat whatever it felt like. It looked like a cryptid itself. If this monster fought that monster, it would be like War of the Gargantuas. I did not think this was a good solution because I was very anti-violence at the time. Still am for the most part. I gave my father a long explanation of why I was against this new dog. He listened until I was done, then told me he got me a job working at the pet shop and I was to report for my first day of work at 8 a.m. sharp in the morning. No staying up late with Dogman that night for me. So anyway, Dad set up a doghouse outside and chained the dog to be able to run around the yard but not beyond. That night, just around midnight, it went crazy barking and we all woke up. I ran to my window in the bedroom on the second floor and saw nothing, just the dog. He barked for about a minute, then he calmed down. That was it. The werewolf never came back. Now my father was stuck taking care of his own pet pit bull monster, but at least he'd scared off the other monster. I really would have preferred a plan in which we got a photo and became world famous. Maybe they even would have named the species after me. But none of that mattered to Dad. All he cared about was me earning minimum wage. A real visionary. But at least he knew how to defend his family against Dogman.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary. Come back for more scary stories.